Hmm. Okay. Darn it. Let's try this again. Alrighty then. This is more prep for the 17th. Today's the 15th, and we're going to continue on with preparation for Wednesday office hours. I've included some other an image that hopefully you'll find useful. It's a millefeuille, and that's kind of what the pastry looks like. Well, it's an exploded version of it. Um, all kinds of stuff gets put in between layers, but that's sort of the point that Mizuoka is talking about when he talks about the example of the millefeuille. Um, so we looked at a bunch of things. I think we left off talking about territorial integration. I mentioned Berry and Garrison's central place theory. I actually found a better illustration from this book, and you can see it here. And I think that what the table does not show the spatial relationships between the centers as that in Kristaller's work. It is the extension of what is partially as shown in figure 5.4. The condition for the territorial integration is also met in Berry and Garrison's system of central places, since it is assumed that the consumers move only to the nearest centers without crossing the boundaries to neighboring complementary reasons. People don't take shortcuts, which may or may not be a good assumption. So this is what it looked like in the original Berry and Garrison article. How N goods are supplied by M center. And makes perfect sense. And from a math point of view, the issue is whether this works out, in a total system, but that's another question. Now we have two central place systems based on different social norms, the egalitarian socialist principle and the capitalist profit-making principle. How are they different in terms of the goods supplied from each order of centers? And what is the implication of the difference from the viewpoint of the spatial struggle and alternative configuration of space? This point is analyzed in section 6 of chapter 9. Subsection E, the dynamism in the territorial integration. So this is the millefeuille. Transformation in the economy, society, and technological development are driving forces to change the configuration of hierarchical systems of space. As technologies for spatial integration and investment in transport and communication facilities develop, the accessibility to the central places improves. Each commodity comes to have a longer range. On the other hand, increasing economies of scale due to technological progress augments the optimal scale of the capital investment for supply, and concomitantly, the demand space extends its threshold. So what we're looking at here, and particularly when we think about rent especially, but without going there, when we talk about demand spaces and other things, we can also talk about rent and also can talk about capital. And so all of these elements are sort of there. This is just the structural elements of that. These processes shift the goods from lower to higher order central places. Thus, a lesser variety of goods is supplied from the lower order centers. The supply function of the lower order centers shall be contracted and eventually declines. As the spatial range of goods gets longer and the consumers can travel faster, thanks to, for example, a bridge built to an island which was separated by the sea from the mainland, or high-speed rail or motorway, it opens up our opportunity for capitalists to seek scale economies because it opens up more demand space. This may also simultaneously lead to a decline of the lower centers, which is called the straw effect. When once self-sufficient, closed and fragmented economic territories are swallowed into the expanding frontier of higher order territory and is included in the national or global market, these former central places lose autonomous centrality and becomes peripheral. The higher centers thus prevail, and more people would get supply from the higher order centers. Having the central place system thus defined, the political power tends to superimpose its hierarchical organizations of administrative and judicial functions over this system. If the dominant power manages to control the ensemble of hierarchical spatial system as a whole, the attempt of subservient people, to undermine the dominant structure through simple escape can be checked and blocked. Boundaries arising out of economic rationality can transform itself into the boundary of prohibitive spatial restriction. Sort of, you could say a food desert might operate that way in a kind of inverted way. This countermeasure of the authority was well manifested in the early Christian church history to prevent illegal escape of the church officials to resist the authority. It's like pope holes. To have larger territorial authorities enforce prohibitions against such movements and coordinate the activities of smaller territories. Consequently, the central place system can become a means of spatial domination for those in power and the spatial fetter for the people. Now, let me break here for a second. This is people can be constrained in a variety of ways. We're seeing that already with trying to insist that you be a citizen in order to take a plane, or that you're not a citizen. It's just, it's just fascism, but needless to say, that's happening. 5.4, the second form, land use coordination. So we talked about kind of spatial things with movement of people. Now we're talking about land use coordination. Section A, introduction. The second form of the real subsumption of the relational space, remember this is a chapter on relational space, is the process to configure the ensemble of territories horizontally in a single spatial scale to create separation through distance and make them adhere to the norm of the dominant economic or political power. Once an economic entity of the society produces an exclusive territory, others can no longer occupy it legitimately. The most primitive way to determine which entity occupies a piece of absolute space, as Wirkungsraum, is the principle of occupation of terra nullius in international law, as explained in Chapter 2. In this principle, the first stable inhabitation of an uninhabited space acquires the exclusive right of occupation. So there's sort of a first come, first served squatters' rights, sort of whatever. After state power begins to intervene and dominate the ensemble of territories, landed property becomes a concept legitimized by a state at a higher spatial scale and regarded as inviolable except in pursuance to the prescribed economic transactions and legal procedures set by the state power. Now, this is the process of land use coordination. An intriguing case is a seated wedding reception in Japan. The reception hall is a nodal space where the relative honorary order of the seating is determined by the distance from the seat of the bride and groom, who sit at the center of the reception room. It is physically impossible to seat all the guests in the seat of honor, which is close to the bride and groom. So if seats are unreserved and the participants take seats on a first-come, first-served basis, then honored guests who come late may be forced to have seats at the periphery of the reception room. Now, since this is not morally appropriate, the host of the wedding ceremony, who has the power to control and dominate the whole reception proceedings, designates the seats such that the distance and the importance in social relations to the couple, are inversely proportional. The host forcibly makes all guests sit in positions based on this principle of controlling spatial order. Now, this is one of the processes of land use coordination. It's a simple example of using a wedding as a discussion of controlling certain spaces that hitherto might not even have they only have spatial designations and perhaps not even a something textual. Anyway, as the scarcity in Wirkungsraum arises in a particular spatial scale, competition for space sets in. Since the relative superiority of positions differ at every point, especially depending on the distance from the node, the competition for relatively superior position needs to be controlled through some principles. The competition is governed by the power under a single principle which covers across that particular scale. In this sense, land use coordination assumes two scales in the ensemble of the spatial configuration. The upper scale, with the controlling power with the principle of landed property, right? This back to the feudalism, and the lower scale where the actual activities take place. Thus, the configuration of horizontal mosaic of the lower scale collective absolute space is rearranged according to the principle dominating in the upper scale. The most common model of land use coordination is von Thunen. That is a sociospatial process in which the power at higher order scale reconfigures the ensemble of territories at the lower order scale, with one node at the core and the concentric territories surrounding according to relative distance from the node. So even if the entire expanse of the lower order scale is not fully subsumed in this sociospatial relation, the process of land use coordination will occur, but partially. Now, from the standpoint of Marxist geography, this process must be explained based on, yes, the ground rent theory in Capital Volume 3, which requires development to handle multiple land use cases. So we revisit in section B, subsection B, the ground rent theory of Marx, revisited. In the circulation of production capital, now note this equation, right? B C prime dash M prime dash C arrow MP means the production, L labor, L. We find two processes of capitalist competition. One is the threefold competition for the realization of the product, C prime, M prime. The other is M prime C, bracket MP. To obtain the means of production that enable capitalists to produce the same product at the lowest individual value. Once market value has been established in the first process of capitalist competition, the way left to capitalists to earn extra surplus value is to produce the same amount of the commodity at a lower individual value by applying a superior condition of production. Now, if this condition of production is reproducible, all capital will eventually adopt it, and thus market value itself shall fall and extra surplus value disappear. However, if this superior condition of production cannot be reproduced and can be monopolized, the second process of capitalist competition comes to the fore. That is, and we've already looked at this, the creation of differential rent. Recall that there are differential rents that Marx looks at relative to Ricardo, right? Differential rent 1 and differential rent 2. Differential rent is not the only form of rent that landed property creates. Monopoly rent is another. Marx himself questions if landed property gives the power to sell the product above its cost price, that is, at its value, why does it not equally well give the power to sell the product above its value at an arbitrary monopoly price? So, this is from Theories of Surplus Value, Part 2. Indeed, landed property occasionally has such a power, particularly in urban areas, to extract another form of rent, that is, monopoly rent. Marx states that a characteristic of the rent of buildings is the prevalence of monopoly prices. Capital Volume 3, and also Harvey, states that class power to achieve monopoly rent, or in his terminology, class-monopoly rent, indeed exists, partly because the landlords, often belonging to a class of speculator developers individually, can survive quite well without releasing all of the resource units under their command. This corresponds to Marx's statement that in all modern societies, a relatively significant portion of the land always remains uncultivated. Capital Volume 3. This type of monopoly rent, which accrues when the product of land is sold not only above its price of production, but also above its value as a result of the barrier that landed property opposes against the rent-free investment of capital on untilled land, is one of the two types of monopoly rent. The other being the case where the monopoly price, independent of rent, creates the rent. So you see there's kind of an inversion of that idea. Differential rent is concerned with unequal products of equal amounts of capital applied to different lands of the same area, which is independent of capital. Two general causes for this inequality are fertility and location of land. Although their theoretical natures are in principle the same. Yes and no. As our point of departure is pristine space without any difference in terms of physical geography, this condition of production is assumed to be related only to distance. Distance constitutes an important element of the use value space, particularly in the property market. The distance from the purchaser's dwelling place to other places, to centers of commerce, work, leisure, culture, or decision, that's Lefebvre. This partly reflects the fact that in case of the ground rent of houses, situation constitutes just as decisive a factor for the differential rent as fertility and situation in the case of agricultural rent. Theories of Surplus Value, Part 2. Now, to analyze the social process, which gives rise to the formation of differential rent, we thus assume that there is land with different qualities in terms of location, or different proximities to the productive and distributive centers, the productive centers and the distributive centers, Department 1 and 2, right? We further assume that the extent of land with such a superior location is physically limited and cannot be reproduced. And note, of course, this changes under, sort of digital economy. Capitalists compete in the process of M-C bracket MP for a plot with a more advantageous location. In this context, Michael Chisholm's 1968 explanation for the process of competition based on the Ricardian model is of importance, as the basic conception of Marx's, quote, first form of differential rent is, in principle, no different from that which Ricardo advanced. That's Harvey in 82, talking about limits of capital. We first take up Chisholm's explanation to examine the social process of competition among the economic subjects that takes place in M-C bracket MP for the creation of the first form of differential rent, or differential rent 1. That was a long way to get there, but it's Capital Volume 3, differential rent 1. Chisholm assumes an imaginary case with two different land fertilities, one yielding, the numbers are going to get crazy here, right? One yielding 2 tons of wheat per annum, and the other 1.5 tons with the same technology. The cultivation of both qualities of land is assumed to be necessary to fill the demand in a town. All land is assumed to be owned by one landlord. Chisholm's explanation goes as follows, quote, the situation in which farmers occupying grade A land get 0.5 ton of wheat more than their neighbors on each hectare they farm, and for no greater outlay. Now, it'd be worth the while of a farmer on grade B land to offer a farmer on grade A soil anything up to 0.5 ton of wheat a year for the right to cultivate a hectare of this better land. This 0.5 ton represents the surplus which the farmer operating the better land obtains through applying his labor there rather than on the poorer farm. Now, in this case, farmer Y on the B quality land may go to the landlord offering to pay 0.25 ton a hectare for the land currently farmed by X on the better land. At the time Y goes to the landlord, nobody pays him anything for the use of land they cultivate. If the landlord accepts the offer, will now obtain 2 tons from each hectare, but will have the additional expense of the 0.25 ton given to the landlord. This will leave him better off by as much as 0.25 ton. On the other hand, farmer X will have to cultivate some of the poorer soil, from which he will be worse off by 0.5 ton. It would therefore, if you haven't been lost by now, it would therefore be to the advantage of farmer X to offer the landlord somewhat more than 0.25 ton to retain the use of his A quality land. If farmer Y offered more, it would be worth the while of X to raise his own bid as high as 0.5 ton, which is the highest figure to which Y would go. Now, at this figure, both farmers would be getting the same return, and the surplus which accrues to the better land would be taken by the landlord. Here, economic rent is 0.5 ton a hectare on the better land and nothing on the poorer. It is equivalent to the surplus production that could be obtained from the use of the better soil above the return which could be obtained by applying the same resources of labor, etc., to the poorer land. Surplus of land A and over B in Chisholm's terminology is in wheat. It transforms itself into economic rent when the market value is regulated by the individual value of the poorest land. This principle of determining market value in the case of the product of land is called the marginal principle, which creates a knotty problem, not a naughty problem, but a knotty problem related to a false social value, Capital Volume 3. The author elaborated on this topic in a separate article of 1979 in Chisholm's statement above. One point should be made clear. If we reformulate the surplus in Chisholm's terminology in terms of the amount of capital invested for a certain amount of wheat, then what seems to be surplus becomes only a saving or reduction of individual value of the labor process of the superior land over the inferior one. So you could say it, well, let's go on. In short, differential rent ultimately boils down to the principle of capitalist competition aimed at production at a lower individual value. The only difference between the products of land and other products is whether the source of such savings is limited and can be monopolized or not. Thus, in the latter case, the saving is the source of extra surplus value going into the pocket of the capitalist, while in the former case, savings become fixed and transforms into differential rent. Now, the above explanation of competition by Chisholm can therefore be interpreted as the process by which the savings in individual value at superior land plots transforms itself into ground rent. We may have to go back over this, and I've got to look up Chisholm now because I haven't read that. So anyway, subsection C, the conditions for land use coordination in the market. Nevertheless, Chisholm's explanation needs to be expanded to include more than one economic sector under the market principle. This amounts to land use coordination under the market principle. Ground rent is created from the social process of subsuming space. Nevertheless, ground rent is not merely the final result of an attempt by capitalism to subsume space. On the contrary, ground rent, the result of the subsumption of space, can emerge as a positive producer of spatial configuration. So Harvey points out, quote, by perpetually striving to put land to its highest and best use, landowners create a sorting device which shifts land uses and forces allocations of capital and labor that might not otherwise occur. Close quote. Marx states rent, quote, rent as the price of land determines the method of production, whether a large amount of capital is concentrated on a small area of land or a small amount of capital is spread over a large area of land, and whether this or that type of product is produced. For example, cattle or corn, the market price of which covers the rent most effectively. There's a surplus value, part 3. In short, ground rent has a dual role in a market economy: the source of income for the landowner and the allocator of the land across the space. The allocator of the land use across the space. In line with the dichotomy of formal subsumption and real subsumption of space, the latter role of ground rent as the sorting device of land use or as a producer of the spatial configuration of capitalism is analyzed here. It is indeed another form of the real subsumption of space. Here, what matters is the intersectoral competition of more than one system of ground rents created through various intersectoral competitions. Now, Marx further elaborates on the above point. In stock, quote, in stock raising and in the general average of all capital invested on the land that does not go into the production of the major staples, such as corn, for example, the determination of price is completely different. Price here is determined by the fact that the price of the product of land, which is used, say, as an artificial pasture for cattle, but which could equally well be turned into arable land of a certain quality, has to rise high enough to yield the same rent as equally good arable land. In this case, therefore, the rent of the corn-growing land is a determining factor in the price of cattle, so that the price of cattle is artificially raised by rent, by the economic expression of landed property, and thus by landed property itself. Volume 3. Close quote. Here, the point is that because of intersectoral land use competition, the price of a product of sector A, which has to compete against sector B for use of land, must pay the rent of the competitors. For example, sector B as well to win the land use competition over sector B. Consequently, the price of the product of sector A is artificially raised under a new demand-supply relationship. Categorically, this rent obviously belongs to monopoly rent, where rent creates the monopoly price in sector A, quote, as a result of the barrier that landed property opposes the investment. These conditions are my point of departure, the author's point of departure, in analyzing the multi-sector land use model. Subsection D, ground rent as a base of the Marxist theory of location, that is intersectoral land use competition. Let us start from the von Thunen ring as modified by August Loesch, 1954, and see how it is adjusted in the Marxian context. Assume two sectors, more intensive sector A and less intensive sector B, run by multiple farmers. In general, the more intensive the land use is, the more crops per hectare are harvested from the land, so that the transportation cost per hectare to bring the harvest to the agricultural market